Have you ever seen a sign language interpreter on TV? I know I have, and I always wondered, is that hard? Especially since I grew up in Texas, where I saw mostly Spanish speakers. And in a lot of ways, it is hard, in more ways than one. Many people today look at interpreters as just helpers, but that's extremely damaging. And today I'll be explaining why it's damaging by looking at the concept of interpreters as helpers versus bilingual bicultural mediators, as explained by authors and researchers Jamita Napier, Rachel McKee, and Della Goswell. Now, the concept of interpreters as helpers stemmed from way before sign language was even recognized as a language. And that, within itself, is why people looked at them like this. They were viewed as mentally and physically handicapped. They looked at people who were deaf, and they saw that they were relying on their family members and their friends for food, medication, money, and jobs. A lot of times they were unhireable. And, for example, if you go to France, you are more likely to bring a close friend or a family member who knew French rather than hiring an interpreter. It's more personal and you know them. The only difference is when you are going to France yourself and you speak another language. They don't view you as in contempt. They view you as someone who speaks a different language, knows a different language, and is unfamiliar with the country. Rather, back then, they looked at somebody who was completely inept. Extremely damaging, and also setting a standard for the rest of the time. So if you look at someone who typically needs help and have a disability, fine. But it's typically a physical disability. Someone who is missing a leg or cannot take care of themselves or do have some kind of mental disability that interrupts how their body reacts. Those are views are helpers, but they still have that language where they can communicate with them. This is also damaging towards the deaf community because it makes them look like they're completely mentally just inept. Napier, McKee, and Goswell explained this, saying that since sign language was not recognized as legitimate language in the earlier era, deaf people were seen to need assistance with a communication handicap, and the interpreter naturally just filled this role, which is what caused this view. Now, the role as an interpreter nowadays is typically looked at a bilingual, bicultural mediator. And this was sprung forth in the 1980s by the ADA. So, to give an accurate interpretation of both languages, what do you need? You need someone who knows both languages, but how well? So, McKee, Goswell, and Napier explain that in order to do this accurately, you need to be fluent in both languages and both cultures, bringing forth the name bilingual, bicultural mediator. Languages have their own idioms and have their own understandings of different phrases that can sometimes be extremely hard to translate, which means that if you have a sentence, for example, raining cats and dogs in English, signing raining cats and dogs would be extremely confusing. And so if you don't know culturally ASL, but you know culturally English, that can get lost in translation. And especially for situations like doctor's offices, this can lead to major misunderstandings and almost deadly results. If you sign something wrong or you misinterpret a concept in one language, say someone signed something and the deaf person misunderstood because of how it was signed, and they were given medication they're allergic to, that could lead to death, which means that learning both languages and both cultures is extremely important. The researchers again acknowledge this by saying, this model acknowledges the competencies required by interpreters to bridge cultural as well as linguistic gaps that may arise between deaf and hearing clients. So it acknowledges both languages, and it also acknowledges how important it is as the role of the interpreter and how it stems far more than just somebody who is helping. They also go to explain that the interpreter's role is more than just helping. It consists of facilitating communication between deaf and hearing people, making appropriate linguistic and cultural decisions in the transfer of messages from one language and person to another. So in conclusion today, I hope you learn the difference between the concept of interpreters and the role of helpers, rather than bilingual, bicultural mediators that are essential for the deaf community, as explained by the authors and researchers Napier, McKee, and Goswell.